Hi ladies and gents. Tonight we wander somewhere older than time and softer than dreams, to a place where sandals slap stone floors, candles flicker low, and the only real drama is whether Brother Oswin remembered to feed the scriptorium cat. Now then, settle deeper into your favorite patch of pillow, dear listener, as we glide quietly into the frayed but fascinating threads of history, specifically into the marvelously uneventful yet soul-soothing world of ancient textile weaving. Picture it: Mesopotamia, a breezy afternoon around 3500 BCE, give or take a few centuries, time being more of a polite suggestion back then than anything else. Somewhere between the Tigris and Euphrates, a very proud man named Enlil-shumu stands next to a pile of flax and mutters, slightly too loudly for anyone's comfort, that no one weaves quite like him. His neighbors nod patiently as they continue twisting fibers with the steely focus of people who understand that if they don't make this tunic today, they'll be embarrassingly unclothed tomorrow. The first looms, simple, upright contraptions that look suspiciously like a door frame with ambitions, were already keeping early humans pleasantly busy. These weren't the large clanking machines of the industrial age, no. These looms had only two settings: wrestle this yarn and pray it doesn't snag. They required not just dexterity, but a monk-like patience, and in many cases, literal monks, or more commonly, women who were both skilled artisans and psychologically prepared for a lifetime of lint. It's easy to think of ancient weaving as just something people did while they waited for iron to be invented. But oh no, it was far more than that. Weaving was life. It was currency. It was mystical. It was, at times, so decorative that someone would invariably die trying to wear it during a celebration involving fire. Take ancient Egypt, for example. Here, in the searing sun along the Nile, linen was practically a second skin, and a third, judging by how many layers some people wore. The flax plant grew in abundance, and while most of us would look at a tangled clump of stalks and think compost, the Egyptians saw garments, burial shrouds, and very long to-do lists. They would extract the fibers, soak them lovingly, like an oat latte, and then beat them enthusiastically until they surrendered their usefulness. It's a process that, if narrated in real time, legally qualifies as a lullaby. And oh, the colours, how the ancients loved their hues. Long before Pantone existed to settle arguments at weddings, Mesopotamians were boiling roots, bugs, and possibly their dignity to achieve the perfect shade of desert oxblood, Noshres 27b. Natural dyes were a big hit, and approximately 89% of them managed to stain both the textile and every good tunic in a 5-mile radius. You see, clothing was more than just necessity. It was art, reputation, and possibly an early form of passive-aggressive social commentary. If you wore purple, for example, you were either royalty or someone pretending very hard to be. The purple dye in question came from thousands of sea snails gently milked, yes, milked, by people who presumably had lost multiple bets. But weaving wasn't just a task for the practically minded. Across ancient cultures, weaving was tangled up, quite literally, in myth. The Greeks, always good for a melodramatic metaphor, had the Moirai, the Fates, who spun, measured, and snipped the threads of your life. Imagine your entire existence managed by 3 elderly spinsters in celestial wool socks, with no clear return policy. Then there were the ancient Chinese, capable of weaving silk so fine it could slip through a ring. Silk production was guarded with such intense secrecy that revealing the method could earn you a delightful execution. It's a detail worth remembering next time you question whether your scarf should cost $20 more for hand-hemmed edges. Back in cozy domestic dwellings, weaving was an act done in the gentle hush between sunrise and chicken noises. There, in dim hearthlight, countless women guided shuttles back and forth, weaving dreams and dinner napkins in the same sit-in. They told stories, sang lullabies, and occasionally grumbled about household goats eating the laundry in progress. So as you ease into your own slumber, remember that the humble woven cloth you snuggle beneath tonight has kin stretching back centuries, woven by hand, patience, and the slightly annoyed mutterings of ancient artisans wondering why no one else offers to clean the spindle. Press that like button before your eyelids press themselves. In the gentle hush of twilight thousands of years ago, before Pinterest boards and seasonal fashion trends, humans reached a pivotal conclusion. Being chilly was in fact dissatisfying. And so, somewhere between chasing mastodons and inventing the wheel, which is not as exciting as it sounds, wheels rolled into use far too slowly. Early humans began to look at plants and animals not merely as lunch or landscaping, but as future outfit material. Now, let's take a cozy stroll, barefoot and with a hint of historical whimsy, into the Neolithic period. The air is moss-scented, someone coughs gently in the distance, and the fashion department of humanity has its grand opening on a farm, because of course it does. Clothing in early civilizations didn't begin with glittering robes or aristocratic collars. No, it began with scratchy, uneven fibers, patience, and the quiet determination of someone who has no concept yet of Black Friday. Enter flax, humanity's first textile sweetheart. Domesticated in the Fertile Crescent possibly as early as 8000 BCE, flax plants were not only edible, but also surprisingly stylish. Once you mashed them, soaked them, combed them, and generally bullied them into submission. And voila, linen was born, a textile so breathable, even mummies wore it. Imagine an early weaver, let's call her Sefet, in a reed hut near the Nile River, squinting in the golden light as she rhythmically moves bundles of thread across a rudimentary loom. Her cat, unimpressed by this ingenuity, sleeps in a basket meant for yarn. The ancient loom, probably horizontal and hugging the floor, creaks now and then, a slow, wooden lullaby echoing across the centuries. You see, the loom is easily one of the unsung heroes of civilization. It's older than the wheel in some places, and certainly more useful when you're trying not to be indecent during a brisk Mesopotamian morning. The simplest looms were often just a few sticks tied together to create enough tension for thread to become cloth. Early weavers made do without instructions, Pinterest hacks, or soothing how-to videos. It was trial by thread. And as with all things humans touch, weaving became more than a necessity. It became a form of expression, a cultural language threaded into existence. Patterns began to symbolize regions, status, and, let's be honest, who had the most enviable sheep. While you might think decorative weaving came much later, even early textiles reveal stripes, checks, and the occasional zigzag. Ancient humans apparently had opinions about aesthetics long before they had written language. Priorities, you know. By the time the Bronze Age strutted onto the scene, looking smug with its shiny tools and slightly improved hygiene, weaving had undergone a quiet revolution. The vertical loom entered stage left, tall, proud, and showing off its warp-weighted structure like a statuesque game of pickup sticks. This loom allowed fabric to grow longer with ease. Greece and Scandinavia fancied these looms, which had stone weights at the bottom to pull threads taut, It's possible the first gym workout came from operating one. Meanwhile, in ancient Peru, the pre-Incan Paracas culture was weaving polychrome funeral mantles so intricate, modern scholars still squint at them and shriek softly. Their weaving was done with backstrap looms, portable, efficient, and capable of turning alpaca into couture, or burials, depending on the occasion. And we mustn't forget China's Neolithic weavers, who were quietly crafting the earliest silks while the West was still arguing about sheep. By at least 3000 BCE, the Chinese had begun to raise silkworms with a level of dedication usually reserved for houseplants and fictional dragons. The silkworm, or Bombyx mori, ate mulberry leaves like it was being paid, weaving itself into a cocoon that could later be unraveled into filaments of silk, light as moonlight, smooth as a compliment, and so luxurious that later it would cause diplomatic chaos. But rewind to these early days. In a small village, a woman adjusts her loom. Her fingers, calloused but graceful, work thread over thread in a silent rhythm, turning tangled plant fiber or animal hair into something both practical and vaguely poetic. Strangely soothing, isn't it? Much like the crackling of a campfire or the distant bleating of a goat who has wandered off again. And so, in quiet corners of ancient earth, by lamplight or sunbeam, fabric began to appear, wrapping early bodies like a second skin, whispering stories in warp and weft. Histories aren't always carved in stone. Some are worn around the shoulders, tucked around sleeping children, or stitched into burial cloths to sail souls into eternity. Soon, those threads will become status symbols, currency, and causes for entire trade wars. But for now, they are warm, homemade, and possibly still smell a little of damp grass. Now, when your eyes grow heavier than a woven flax tunic in the rain, breathe gently. For nestled in the threads of history is more than just cloth. There is comfort. And not far ahead, glimmering through the folds, lies a tale of dyes, deception, and the small sea creature that turned emperors purple. As the ancient wind traced lazy loops over the sun-stained hills of Mesopotamia, where sheep dotted the land like moving clouds with opinions, the early weavers of humanity began their fateful affair with string. Yes, humble string, long, patient, and determined, much like your journey to sleep tonight. Long before bolts of velvet lined royal halls or hip Egyptians strutted about in tastefully pleated linens, there existed a modest miracle, the spindle. Picture it. Somewhere around 5000 BCE, an industrious Sumerian, most likely with dust on their hands and questionable sandals, took fibers from sheep, twisted them rhythmically, and said, this could be stronger. Thus, yarn was born, and with it, the dreamy beginnings of mankind's never-ending love story with textiles. Now here's where the tale starts to unravel, pun gently intended. You see, fiber spinning was not just something ancient people did when Netflix was unavailable. It was a sacred act, performed primarily, but not exclusively, by women, who spun beside hearth fires, beneath stars, and occasionally while yelling at goats. It was slow, intentional work, a hypnotic dance of fingers and whirls where plants or animal fluff transformed into long strands of potential. They did not yet have looms, not the complicated wooden contraptions you might be picturing at least. Early on, they had what's best described as proto-looms, sticks jammed into the ground with weights tied to threads. Ah yes, the timeless elegance of doing your best with what you have. These setups were called warp-weighted looms, and they leaned gently against walls or trees like they were trying not to be noticed. Threads hung vertically, anchored by clay or stone weights at the bottom, swaying softly in the warm breeze, like sleepy socialites at a toga party. Weavers would pass horizontal threads, the weft if you want to show off at bar trivia, gently in and out of their vertical cousins, the warp. This slow task, almost meditative in rhythm, gradually built the earliest fabrics known to history. The sounds of this early weaving were gentle, a soft thump of weights shifting, the whisper of fingers brushing fibre, a tired sheep letting out a meh in the background. It was pleasant, repetitive, perfect for lulling the mind into rest. Whether you were weaving a future tunic or just avoiding conversation, this work brought peace, and sometimes sheep drool. But make no mistake, this was not idle embroidery. Cloth was wealth, cloth was status, and if you ever misplaced a bolt of it, well, may the gods have mercy, especially if you were supposed to deliver it to a temple scribe named Neribal, who'd waited 13 lunar cycles and was not in the mood for excuses about rogue llamas. Yes, cloth was currency in its own right. In Sumerian city-states like Ur and Lagash, textiles were traded across deserts, drifted up rivers, and were even offered to deities, who, if the surviving tablets are to be believed, had a suspiciously fine taste in wool blends. And yet, dear sleeper, this early textile economy held more than just riches. It carried meaning. The act of weaving was woven, quite literally, into the mythology of time. Some cultures believed the universe itself was spun from thread. The Mesopotamian goddess Utu, for instance, was not just a deity of weaving, but also of fate. In her careful twistings and windings, she held destinies, much like the way your sheets hug you now, or how that one sock mysteriously disappears after every laundry cycle, perhaps spirited away by a mischievous loom goblin of yore. It's easy to overlook this dusty spin in the grand carousel of history, but these early woven cloths, their fibers uneven, their patterns simple, held the world together more literally than the pyramids or the Great Wall ever did. The first tunics worn by workers in fields, the sacks used to carry grain, the humble beds people curled into after long days of spinning out survival, all were born from these slow, deliberate weavings. And sleep, too, came more easily beneath hand-woven blankets. There was a comfort in knowing that each thread had been touched, turned, and tied by human hands. That someone had once stood beneath the sun, twisting wool by firelight, perhaps humming softly, perhaps dreaming of warmer socks for winter. As you begin to drift from daylight's threads into the loom of dreams, a new sound stirs on the breeze, gentle clacks, steadier now, like wooden bones exhaling. In another place, another time, someone is building something more formidable, something that promises a revolution in warp and weft, something called the loom. A dreamy hush spreads across the valley of ancient Mesopotamia as the sun stretches its golden arms over the baked mud brick rooftops. And there, amid the fields of flax and the murmur of sleepy riverbanks, early weavers rise, slowly, reluctantly, a little like you when it's Monday morning and coffee hasn't kicked in yet. But these folks weren't scrambling for emails and smartphones. No, they were setting about the delicate business of turning plants into pants, or at least loincloths. It was a patient, itchy revolution. Flax, the original hipster fiber, was the little plant that could and did. It grew well in the nutrient-rich soils near the Tigris and Euphrates, and its fibrous stalks, once soaked and hammered and combed and cajoled, turned into linen so fine that even ancient temple priests were like, yes, this will do nicely. Mind you, this was long before dry cleaning, so it was best not to imagine the fragrance of ceremonial robes after a few sacrificial goat sessions. To process flax, Mesopotamians used a series of tools so rudimentary, and I say this lovingly, that even a particularly motivated squirrel could have fashioned them. But what they lacked in gleaming complexity, they made up for in good old human stubbornness. First, the flax was retted, which means soaking it in water until it smelled vaguely like fermented pond. Then came beating and scutching, which sound aggressive and kind of are. The goal was to free the fibers from the woody stem, like separating spaghetti from a really grumpy fork. And once they had their beautiful linen strands, the spinning began. Now, spinning in ancient times was not the Angora cat on YouTube variety. It was a quiet, meditative act, and a social one too. Women, mostly, gathered with spindles in hand, gossip in full supply, and far more patience than seems humanly reasonable. They twist, drop, and spin, using a tool called a drop spindle. It looks a little like someone shrunk a flying saucer and tied a string to it. The fibers twisted into thread, and just like that, the world had yarn, which is more than you can say for your last crafting attempt. With that macrame kit, you still haven't opened. Even their looms were charming contraptions, vertical warp-weighted wonders that leaned against house walls like sleepy sheep. Warp threads hung like tiny suspended hammocks, anchored by smooth weights made of stone or clay. The weaver would pass the woof thread, yes, woof, like a scholarly dog, over and under with a rhythm that could lull anyone into a trance, including, possibly, the weaver herself. You see, weaving was not merely a domestic duty, it was an act of creation, a kind of magical architecture made thread by thread. Patterns slowly emerged, just as dreams form in the sloshy corners of your half-sleeping brain. A simple grid of lines could become a checkerboard of status, because guess what? Linen wasn't just practical, it was political. The priest could wear white linen, the farmer wore coarser cloth, the merchant had patterns. The queen, oh, she shimmered. And if you saw a spindle hanging from someone's belt, you knew their day involved more twisting than a plot-heavy Netflix drama. The more skillful the weaving, the higher your cloth kudos. It was wearable, reputation. Fabric, after all, was the original social media, except it covered your body instead of revealing your lunch. And in case you were wondering, no, they didn't do it for free. Weaving was serious business. Textiles were among Mesopotamia's hottest exports, second only to grain and dramatic flood stories. Whole economies spun, puns softly intended, around the wool and flax industries. In fact, in temple economies, elite women supervised entire weaving workshops where dozens of workers produced cloth for trade and tribute. Forget corporate glass ceilings. These women had loom-based empires, and they ran them like thread-count tyrants. Still, under the moonlight, after the clatter of looms and the gentle bickering over pattern details had faded into night, one can imagine the weavers resting by the fire, fingers slightly sore, laughter trailing into the shadows. Cloth hung drying in doorways. Dogs snored somewhere. Stars wheeled above muddy courtyards. There was poetry in weaving, and it was not stitched with words, but with fibers. Fibers that held warmth, memory, and a touch of cosmic stubbornness. And as the warp weight swayed gently in the breeze, creaking just so, a sleepy sound to match a sleepy soul, we drift onward to where sheep bleat softly on distant hills, ready to contribute their fuzzy expertise to the next chapter of this yarn-laced tale. As the sun slipped lazily over the terracotta horizons of ancient Egypt, casting honeyed light across the Nile, One might imagine a pharaoh striding forth in gold-threaded splendor. But beneath this gilded spectacle lay the quiet triumph of textile weaving, the civilized art of turning plant stalks into something that wouldn't scratch your royal extremities. Let us drift closer now, into the sun-drenched courtyards of Thebes, where linen reigned supreme, the soft, exquisitely tedious pride of Egyptian fabric. There was no cotton, silk, or polyester blend to cheat the delicacy of labor back then. No, linen was the fabric of gods, nobles, and overly demanding priesthoods. And oh, what a tangled flaxen web they wove. Flax, the plant that launched 1,000 tunics, was a picky little botanical gremlin. It required careful cultivation, plenty of water, and just the right amount of snobbish gazes. Once harvested, it had to be retted, which is a pleasant-sounding name for the unglamorous task of soaking it in water until the fibers gave up and separated out of sheer exhaustion. After retting came breaking, which sounds violent only because it was. The now limp, soggy flax was beaten, stomped, and scraped until only the usable fibers remained. These were heckled, a process that, despite the name, did not involve shouting insults at the flax, but rather dragging it through sharp combs to straighten it out. Though, given how uncooperative flax could be, a few exasperated yells were probably involved. At long last, usable threads emerged, ready to be spun into yarn. This was no lightning-speed spinning wheel affair. Ancient Egyptian spinners worked with drop spindles, elegant tools that resembled little more than a wooden stick with a disc on it, like a humble yo-yo with delusions of grandeur. Suspended from the hand, the spindle danced in slow pirouettes, twisting fibers into thread with a patient rhythm that could lull even the most caffeinated camel into a nap. Spinners were usually women, often working alongside one another, chatting softly under fig trees or whispering the latest temple gossip as their fingers twisted fate into form. Each thread told a story of morning songs, dusty sandals, and the slow gratitude of creating something enduringly useful, even if it was just undergarments for a high priest who hadn't smiled since the reign of Ramses II. Weaving itself took place on vertical looms, tall as a man and stoic as a temple column. Threads were strung like tight harp strings, called the warp, and the weaver would insert the weft. Think of it like sewing sideways, sliding threads over and under in rhythmic succession. Some looms even leaned against walls like ancient yoga poses, a bit wobbly but spiritually fulfilling. It was repetitive work, yet meditative. There was a sacredness to it, for cloth wasn't merely utility in Egypt. It was currency, offering, respect. Tombs were stuffed with woven linens, swaddling the dead with all the dignity that bureaucracy required in the afterlife. Taxes might be paid in linen, and temple staff were often compensated in cloth. A charmingly tangible salary if you happened to prefer tunics over silver. More than clothing, linen became a symbol of purity. Priests wore it exclusively, often changing garments several times a day, presumably to stay as spotless as their own metaphysical egos. The Book of the Dead even began to look like a laundry list of what you must wear, how you must enter, and which laundry deity you must flatter with incense and offers of extra starch. And still, each bolt of cloth began with the quiet patience of a woman at her spindle, spinning stories into thread while the Nile whispered its own eternal lullaby. By moonlight, when the bustle of temples softened and even the crocodiles took their evening sighs, the weaver's loom stood like solemn sentinels in the dark, a few threads left trailing perhaps as if the fabric of life itself kept weaving even after the hands had gone still. And in another corner of the ancient world, far to the east, another gentle revolution was beginning to unravel, one guided by worms, hijacked mulberry trees, and a touch of imperial espionage. Look closely, and you'll find the first glistening glimmers of silk awaiting their moment. As the shuttle of time glides softly across the warp of civilization, we now drift into the drowsy glow of ancient Mesopotamia, the land of zigzagging rivers, ziggurats, and surprisingly detailed administrative records. If Egypt gets the gold, Leaf and Greece the marble pedestal, Mesopotamia humbly offers us clay tablets with tax codes, and yes, some crucial threads of textile history. Here, some 5,000 years ago, the people of Sumer were mastering the fine and frequently underestimated art of weaving. How fine could it be, you may whisper, half asleep? Well, consider this. These early urbanites were among the first to see fabric not just as function, but as prestige. A rough tunic might keep you from scandal, but if you had the right wool in Uruk, why, you could turn a few heads while fetching barley at the market. The Mesopotamians spun their wool from the fat-tailed sheep that roamed their lands, plump little creatures that looked rather like someone had inflated their posteriors with a bicycle pump. These sheep were prized not only for their hilarious silhouettes, but for their thick, coarse wool, ideal, perhaps, for rug-like capes and stern winter bedding, though less so for breezy summer wear. But fashion, even then, bowed to what was available. And so the Mesopotamians spun their sturdy yarns, wove their sturdy cloth, and wore their sturdy everything, really. Now, the Mesopotamian loom was of the vertical variety, typically propped against a wall and made of wood. Weights, often beautifully shaped ceramic donuts, hung from the threads to keep everything taut. As you can imagine, looms clacked gently in the background as women, mostly, worked with rhythmic patience, counting threads like we might count sheep on nights when sleep is being stubborn. We should pause here for a snoozy chuckle about those ceramic loom weights. Archaeologists once puzzled over their donut-shaped form, unsure of their purpose. For a brief blip in scholarly discourse, a few enthusiastic theorists proposed they might be children's toys, or, my personal favourite, primitive bagels. While the idea of ancient bakers stacking earthenware bagels for a quick break-time snack is deeply pleasing, the real reason was gravity. You needed the threads to hang straight, and nothing encourages vertical diligence quite like a heavy donut pulling you gently toward the earth. Now, it would be unkind to drift away from Mesopotamia without acknowledging one of its most exquisitely dreamy contributions to textile history, flax cultivation. While not exclusive to this region, flax was grown and spun with a dedication that bordered on poetic. Flax fibers extracted from the stems of the plant using a process both delicate and dreadfully laborious produce linen. This linen, dear listener, wasn't merely a cloth, it was a symbol, a whisper from the gods enshrined within the wardrobe. Linen garments were considered pure, light, and sacred. In some temples, priests wore nothing but linen, lest impure fibers offend the divine nostrils. And so, before donning their holy robes, they might well have muttered a soft prayer such as, "O Ninlil, goddess of the south wind, keep this tunic from chafing." Meanwhile, trade in textiles blossomed along the winding routes of the Tigris and Euphrates. Woolen and linen goods flowed between cities like threads themselves, connecting societies within complex looms of economy and diplomacy. Weavers transformed not just lives, but livelihoods. A skilled weaver might earn enough to afford a second goat, or a slightly superior date palm, or even a clay tablet scribbled with a poem about said goat. Let us also not forget the bureaucrats, those flax-robed bean counters of Babylon, who catalogued every thread woven and every tunic issued. There's a striking clay tablet inscribed in neat cuneiform that baldly reads, 9 garments sent to temple workers, itemized. It may not stir the soul like an epic of Gilgamesh, but in its own quiet way, it sings of a civilization trying to wrap the chaos of life in orderly cloth. The sun rose hot on the ziggurats, and still the looms clacked. These weavers, I like to imagine, hummed softly to themselves as the threads picked up the light. Some hummed laments, others the newest ode to Inanna. Perhaps one cheeky soul made up lyrics like, "If your warp is tangled, so is your fate." And as the desert winds tousled their hair, those ancient artisans wove not only garments, but history itself, one measured thread at a time. Let your eyes drift now, as our gentle story turns toward the eastern plains, where the Indus Valley people are quietly inventing their own textile magic, with a splash more color and a lot more fish motifs. In the pre-dawn mist of an average Babylonian Tuesday, around 1750 BCE, give or take a few ceremonial goat dances, textile weaving reached an oddly magnificent peak. Not the sort of peak where crowds cheered and statues were built, of course. No, it was more of a quiet, thread count-related crescendo, celebrated mostly by slightly sore-armed artisans and scribes who really liked inventories. The Babylonians, perched rather impressively between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, were fond of things that could be counted and catalogued: grains, sheep, stars, and, as luck would have it, looms. If you had a steady hand and a tolerance for papyrus splinters, you might have spent your youth recording fabric rolls in cuneiform, a laborious language forged by the necessity of bureaucracy and damp clay. We don't often imagine ancient Mesopotamians lounging in luxury, but let us, just for a moment, picture Nebuchadnezzar, a hypothetical mustache-proud clerk, reclining on a woven reed mat, sipping whatever counted as an acceptable herbal drink back then, perhaps barley tea with a vague hint of goat. Around him, dyers stirred vats of indigo and madder root, while weavers rhythmically tapped their looms, interrupted only occasionally by mud brick-related gossip. Textiles in Babylon weren't just functional. They were forms of communication, markers of social status, temple offerings, and highly portable wealth. A swath of fine linen could do more networking for you than a dozen awkward handshakes at a ziggurat summit. Your outfit whispered things like, "I know a guy with a dye source," or "My cousin married into the wool district." And then there were the looms themselves. Large, vertical, almost proud in stature. Loom operas, really. Monumental compared to their humble basket-weaving cousins. These upright contraptions demanded both physical dexterity and the patience of a dad teaching his teenager to drive a camel cart. They stood, not tucked away but central, often in courtyards or under shade awnings, where the interplay of warp and weft became part of daily life. It was work that built muscle and metaphors. To weave, after all, was to bring order from threads, a noble pursuit in a world where even your neighbor's goat might wander off with your laundry. Now, let's amble delicately into the matter of dyes. Babylonian textiles weren't just beige-on-beige affairs. No, the art of coloring cloth was a kind of wizardry involving fermented mollusks, crushed bugs, and leaves mashed with alarming enthusiasm. The color purple, in particular, was so absurdly difficult to make, requiring the sad demise of many a murex snail, that it became a chromatic synonym for wealth and occasional pretentiousness. if you caught a glimpse of someone strutting in royal purple, chances were they either ruled a city, audited temple balances, or just had extremely good mollusk connections. Textiles also had sacred significance. Temples like the great ziggurat of Marduk didn't just house gods and slightly lost pilgrims. They were repositories of sumptuous fabric offerings. Priestly robes were woven to exacting standards, which led to the emergence of temple-sponsored workshops, staffed primarily by women who were as sharp with a spindle as they were with a side-eye. Some of these women worked for years weaving ritual garments, their names and duties recorded on clay tablets. Well, some names at least. It's one of history's charming quirks that the weavers who preserved ceremonial elegance remained largely anonymous, while the priest who accidentally dropped a torch during the fire festival is referenced 8 times in surviving records. Still, histories are, much like weaving itself, a process of interlocking what is known with what is imagined, and as the coils of memory twist themselves together, you can almost hear the murmured repetitions of the weavers, their movements as practiced and soothing as a lullaby hummed by millennia. So next time you fidget with a blanket corner or marvel at your 1,000-thread count sheets, remember, they once traced back to the reeds of Mesopotamia, to temple looms, and to long-deceased snails whose sacrifices dyed the ancient world. As the loom's soft tapping blends into the stillness of desert winds, we drift onward to another place, a land of linen, sandstorms, and the world's most determined triangle enthusiasts. In the high silken hush of twilight, when the stars begin to gossip quietly above Babylon, our thread takes us by the hand and meanders into the realm of ancient looms. Not just looms of linen and wool, but looms of power, coin, and societal clout. Yes, my sleepy stargazer, we are now arriving at the shimmering intersection of textiles and economy. It's more riveting than it sounds. And that's saying something, because rivets have nothing to do with cloth and everything to do with trousers you're not wearing to bed. Now, picture the ancient world not as a dusty palette of beige tunics and mismatched sandals, but rather as an intricate economy spun quite literally from the fibers of flax, wool, and even, for the bold and beat-stained elite, the elusive Tyrian purple. In Mesopotamia, weaving wasn't just a domestic art, it was a state affair. Imagine, if you will, entire temples doubling as textile factories, scribes weaving ledgers while priestesses wove linen. Everyone in Mesopotamia was either weaving, accounting for weaving, sacrificing goats, or asking someone else about weaving. It was a full-time culture. You see, large temple complexes, particularly in cities like Uruk and Ur, became bureaucratic weaving hubs. Women, often organized into what scholars elegantly term weaving workshops, spent dawn to dusk converting raw fleece into finished bolts of cloth. The state distributed wool and collected finished products in return, much like your landlord collects rent, except less monthly panic and more organized taxation through yarn. In many ways, textiles served as the soft, cozy backbone of the ancient economy. They were currency before coinage took the runway. Textiles were traded, paid as wages, donated as offerings, and sometimes gently bartered for beer. Yes, beer. Because if you were going to spend your day spinning thread, you'd want a sip of something frothy before confronting warp tension. Now, if Babylon was threading the bureaucratic needle, Egypt was wearing the tunic of international commerce. Egyptian linen was so fine, so sheer, that Pharaoh himself might be accused of wearing flattering papyrus. Delegations from the Levant, Crete, and beyond would travel great distances to secure this breezy cloth, known to be spun as fine as 200 threads per inch. That's not so much a fabric as a near poetic suggestion of one. The workers, often women of the household or employed in elaborate state-controlled operations, were masters of consistency. Spindles were balanced with a kind of mystical symmetry, and looms were managed with a serenity that only millennia of sand-blown patience could teach. And while in today's world, status is scanned with a barcode or a brutally unflattering security badge, in ancient Egypt, your closet could very well elevate your entire status in society. High thread count, high social rank, and let us not overlook the grand multiplicity of barter. In the markets of ancient Anatolia, bolts of woven cloth often shuffled hands instead of coins. A well-crafted tunic could win you a mule, a basket of figs, or, for those of discerning taste, a distinctly average amphora of wine that promised much and delivered only a mild headache. Even in the high realms of imperial Rome, before senators suffered indigestion from conquest, the cloth trade kept humming. The togas they elegantly draped themselves in were painstakingly crafted. While the fabled toga might have looked like a pile of bed linens in the laundry heap, its fabric provenance could open doors or wine cellars. Textiles supported entire guilds and economies, and their production employed an army of weavers, dyers, and laundresses with forearms you dare not challenge in arm wrestling. By now, it may be becoming clear that textiles were not only a matter of comfort or coverage, they were woven deeply into the very financial veins of civilization. Each warp and weft crossed in rhythm with ancient transactions, state control, cultural status, and dreams of trade and distant ports. Soft power, as modern diplomats might call it. But here, it was also literal. And so tonight, as your breath slows and your blankets wrap you like the finest Egyptian linen, albeit without the royal starching, allow your thoughts to drift toward the industrious hum of a temple loom, the scent of fresh spun flax on river breeze, and the timeless notion that even the quiet cadence of a spinning wheel once kept an empire turning. And in the dim candlelight of the next page in our tale, that wheel continues its gentle rotation. Meanwhile, beneath the soft sun of what is now northern Germany, back when mammoths were an occasional passing traffic hazard, a curious kind of cloth was being woven, one that would, in time, serve no fewer than three purposes: covering one's dignity, impressing the neighbors, and frustrating archaeologists forevermore. The early peoples of Neolithic Europe had begun to master the art of spinning flax into linen. And when we say art, we mean it in the same way cave paintings were art. A mix of great ambition, baffling patience, and the occasional unidentifiable squiggle. Imagine it. A small collection of humans living in a half-sunken, timber-framed hut, sun dappling through smoke holes, while someone sat on a low stool and painstakingly twisted fibers between their fingers, muttering quiet curses at the breeze that dared to tangle their progress. Flax, you see, is not the most cooperative crop. It grows tall and elegantly, yes, like it's auditioning for a side role in a whimsical folk tale. But turning its fibers into thread required a process that was, generously put, involved. First, it needed to be harvested at the right moment by hand, then soaked in water until it began to rot. Yes, rot. This charming step was known as retting, and it's just as fragrant as it sounds. After retting came scutching, in which plant stalks were beaten with wooden blades. Pounding stalks with planks was not only a method of fiber separation, but also a fantastic way to release tension. A prehistoric spa treatment, if you will. Then, The fibers were hackled, pulled through combs bristling with nails, until smooth and shiny and ready to be spun. Spindles at this time were a matter of necessity, not luxury. Typically, a stick with a weight called a whirl made of clay, stone, or occasionally pure spite. Women, often tasked with the spinning, would walk throughout the day with the spindle spinning from one hand, twisting fibers as they went about their errands, weaving threads of linen as effortlessly as some of us hum while we tidy. Now, this might sound repetitive, but monotony was the secret source of ancient productivity. Spinning and weaving were rhythmic, and rhythm, quite naturally, lulls the mind into that kind, sleepy place where ideas sprout quietly, like moss, and time feels less linear, more like a gently folded sheet, freshly woven. Archaeologists have stumbled upon remnants of Neolithic textiles tucked away in peat bogs and burial sites. Soil's slow, damp way of filing things under miscellaneous. These rare scraps show us that woven linen was not just utilitarian, but occasionally suspiciously decorative. Patterns began to emerge, simple at first. Lines, checks, and diamond shapes made painstakingly by counting threads. One imagines a weaver, eyes squinting in the firelight, narrating to themselves, "Over one, under two, good gods, what row am I on?" A quiet existential crisis wrapped in warp and weft. And speaking of decorative ambitions, let us marvel for a sleepy moment at the arrival of textile dyes. Early attempts at coloring fabric involved bold experimentation with plants, soil, and possibly furious guesses. Half of Bronze Age Europe went around draped in dubious shades of brown-green, while the other half pretended that was very fashionable. Still, ochres, woad, and crushed insects began to liven up the otherwise honest palette of beige. Oddly enough, woven linen was considered quite elite in some parts. While your average wool-clad peasant shivered through winter, the linen wrapped were thought to exude status. Fine linen made from longer and more delicately spun fibers took longer to make and was less itchy. Two hallmarks of prestige. It's the ancient equivalent of wearing a shirt that says, "I have 2 goats and a whole week's worth of leisure." And just to round off the cozy absurdities of textile life, there's this. People started leaving weaved objects in ritual pits. Sometimes it was cloth, sometimes clothing, and sometimes mystery cords arranged in what we suspect might be early art, or an offering, or the result of someone forgetting what they were doing halfway through a project. Regardless, Neolithic weaving had stretched past survival and wandered into the sacred. Cloth was no longer just for covering, it was for meaning. As evening falls again over our historical landscape, threads dangle softly in the air, like the whispers of hands that once spun beneath smoke-darkened rafters. Ancient looms, now quiet, echo only in museum glass and quietly exaggerated lectures. But somewhere in the dim of twilight-lit prehistory, a weaver picks her way through flax bundles, hums a soft tune, and begins her count again. Over 1, under 2. The loom creaks once more, just enough to beckon us further into the weft and web of another woven world, in a hushed corner of antiquity, around the age when donkeys were still considered cutting-edge transportation, and sandals were, amusingly, the height of both fashion and utility. The art of fulling made its dramatic and rather damp entrance onto the textile stage. Now, fulling may sound like something your grandmother might do after a particularly satisfying meal, but in the ancient world, it was a crucial finishing touch in the life of cloth. Without it, you wouldn't have that tight, wearable wool fabric that didn't immediately unravel at the first sneeze. fulling was a laborious, soggy, and occasionally smelly process. In other words, bedtime storytelling gold. The Greeks called them katatagoi, and the Romans, never to be outdone in the naming department, referred to the craftsmen as fullones. They were the original laundry scientists of the ancient world, except with fewer beakers and more stomping. That's right, before machines, before detergent pods, and long before scented dryer sheets, people cleaned and thickened their cloth by dancing on it. Well, stomping with purpose, really. The process involves soaking the woolen cloth in a vat of liquid, then treading upon it, rhythmically, until it reached just the right texture and consistency. Imagine a soft woolen grape stomp, but with the goal of not ruining your tunic. Now, what did they use to soak the cloth, you ask? Brace yourself, dear listener, for this is one of history's less romantic secrets. One of the most effective ingredients in the fulling process was human urine. That's right. For centuries, human pee was the secret sauce in the transformative journey from scraggly raw wool to soft, tight, wearable fabric. The ammonia in urine acted as a cleansing agent, dissolving oils and greases left on the wool from the sheep's rather outdoorsy lifestyle. But how, you ask, did they gather such a peculiar resource in bulk? Public urinals, of course. Not your modern porcelain affairs, but clay pots left on street corners where passers-by could make a, shall we say, moist donation. In Rome, collecting urine became such an important industry that Emperor Vespasian famously taxed it. When someone challenged the dignity of profiting from bodily fluids, he allegedly held up a coin and asked if it smelled. Upon the answer, no, he quipped, and yet it comes from urine. Historical zingers, ancient economy, lessons, and bodily functions, all in one imperial moment. Once the cloth had been well marinated and thoroughly stomped, no small feat in a time without rubber boots, it would be rinsed, spread, and brushed until it resembled something you might actually be willing to wear on your shoulders in public. Fulonicae, the washhouses of ancient Rome, were hives of stomping activity. Inside, workers plodded barefoot through rectangular tubs, their feet becoming wrinkled and battle-worn from soaking day in and day out. It was damp, smelly work, often looked down upon by polite society. But much like the custodians of modern luxury, fullers made togas respectable. Interestingly, some fullers tried to up their style game. Ancient graffiti in Pompeii reveals that some fullers took great pride in their work. In fact, at least one fuller successfully ran for political office, possibly carried to victory on the damp votes of his stomping brethren. Never underestimate a man with a strong arch and a keen knowledge of ammonia-based cleaning solutions. In addition to washing, fullers also treated fabrics with various substances to give them sheen and texture. Earthy powders, oils, sometimes even African clay known for giving wool a richer hue. There was a science to it, albeit one more aromatic than academic, and so, under the warm Mediterranean sun, or bundled around a flickering oil lamp on a chillier day, fabrics were worked, reworked, and lovingly fluffed into wearable art, thanks in part to humanity's commitment to both hygiene and reusing resources, even the awkward ones. As the last droplets trickled from the stretched cloth and dried gently in the breeze, the fullers hung up their togas for the night, feet aching but proud. Tomorrow, more cloth would arrive, more treading would be done, and yes, more jars would be dutifully filled. But let's not rush into tomorrow's stomping just yet. Stay nestled where you are, for loom and wool are taking us somewhere new. Spindles are humming in the next room, and dyes, rich, rare and peculiar, are patiently waiting for their turn in the story. As twilight deepened over the fertile banks of the Tigris and Euphrates, the ancient weavers of Mesopotamia clicked their looms in rhythmic harmony, as though whispering a lullaby to the gentle hush of the desert wind. It was here, amongst the mud brick homes and bustling bazaars scented faintly of dates and goat, that some of the world's earliest woven sorcery bloomed. And by sorcery, of course, we mean extremely labor-intensive textile production, powered entirely by strong backs, nimble fingers, and the occasional domesticated sheep with boundary issues. Now, Mesopotamia was many things: the cradle of civilization, the inventor of cuneiform, and, less famously, the place where people thought, what if I didn't have to be naked all the time? Thus entered flax. Flax is not, I admit, the most charismatic of crops. It is not flamboyant, like the purple snail dyes of the Phoenicians, nor does it sound like something you'd want to wear to a royal banquet. But flax, bless its fibrous little soul, was the unsung hero of early civilization. Grown across the fertile crescents and ferried in bundles to eager weavers, it was soaked, scutched, and spun into linen, a fabric both breathable and opaque, ideal for desert dwellers who preferred to keep parts of themselves out of the sun's accusatory glare. The earliest linen garments were not what we would call flattering. Think rectangles with a neck hole, a look somewhere between minimalist chic and I got tangled in curtains. But fashion, as always, was not the point. These robes told stories, not in patterns or print, but in their very existence, because behind every square of linen was a weaver, and behind every weaver was a hierarchy, and possibly a goat eating a loom leg when no one was looking. Weavers in Mesopotamia held a curious social position. They weren't quite peasants nor elite artisans, but wobbled somewhere in between depending on whether their master was a temple, a palace, or a very entrepreneurial family of sheep herders. You see, weaving wasn't just a hobby, it was state business. Temples needed robes, palaces demanded tapestries, and average citizens wanted something, anything to keep the dust out. It's worth noting that Mesopotamian looms were vertical, not unlike the harp-shaped nightmares from which ancient beauty was birthed. 2 wooden uprights, a bar across the top, and a small fortune in string. The warp threads hung tantalizingly down, while weavers, and often their children, moved the weft side to side with something called a shuttle, which had nothing to do with NASA or space, but was equally complex if you were 4 years old and holding one upside down, while a very stern aunt judged your tension control. Into these vertical looms, threads of flax were woven with astonishing care. The rhythm of the loom was said to soothe the soul, which was helpful given that the process could be, how shall I put this, less than thrilling. Monks centuries later would meditate in silence. Mesopotamian weavers were just on hour 6 of counting warp threads, inventing inner peace one spindle at a time. And of course, textile economics existed even then. Markets in cities like and Lagash offered bolts of fabric in exchange for silver, barley, or goats of suspicious lineage. Linen became a kind of currency, lightweight, durable, and too scratchy for counterfeiting. If your linen crinkled wrong, people would ask questions. There were rumors too, that the best flax grew under moonlight, that sheep whispered secrets about thread tension to patient herders, that if you wore a robe woven during the spring flood, you'd never drop a fig loaf again. Whether true or not, these were the whispered spells nestled in woven threads, omens and dreams passed down loom by loom. And in the quiet, Hours, when the dye pots cooled and the final knots were tied. The weavers would hang up their shuttles, rub tired calluses, and sleep beneath their own handiwork. Linen sheets, scratchy with pride and patience, warmed by the day's sun, and the dreams yet unspun. Now, if you think fabric economics was uneventful, just wait until we unravel the deeply competitive world of temple weavers and holy cloth contracts. A tale of threads, thrones, and possibly invading llamas. But that's for a slightly sleepier page to come. If one were to pick the quietest revolution in history, it might just be the introduction of the spinning wheel. Not with a bang, but with the faint, repetitive purr of cotton, linen, and wool, making elegant spirals under the calloused thumbs of weavers who really just wanted to keep up with demand and maybe stop getting wrist cramps from the drop spindle. The spinning wheel arrived in the Islamic world sometime around the 11th century and spun its leisurely way into Europe by the 13th. But, like all guests of medieval innovation, it wasn't greeted with a trumpet fanfare. No, it sidled in, quietly revolutionized yarn production, and then got blamed centuries later in fairy tales for pricking princesses into a century-long nap. A mixed legacy, truly. But before Sleeping Beauty dozed off on his deadly spindle, the spinning wheel had become the trusted confidant of countless weavers. Imagine, if you will, a ruddy-cheeked spinner sitting by the hearth, the wheel whirring softly as dusk falls beyond the window pane. Outside, chickens cluck dismissively, and a neighbor shouts about his gout. But inside the cottage, the fibers spin into thread with meditative calm, an act both domestic and oddly poetic. Unlike the drop spindle, which required a weaver to constantly drop, twirl, and gather, the spinning wheel allowed for a seated, almost graceful rhythm. 1 foot on the treadle, hands on the fibers, the spinner became one with the rotational ritual. There was no word for ergonomics in 13th century Europe, but if there had been, someone might have jubilantly scribbled it in sheep's blood, or whatever passed for ink back then. Of course, innovation comes at a social cost, and in many cases, the cost was boredom. What had once been an intensely manual social affair, filled with chit-chat and the occasional scandalous town gossip, began to rely more on solitary labor. The spinner's circle was shrinking, literally and temporally. Scholars note that spinning went faster, and when any task in history speeds up, someone somewhere inevitably makes you do more of it. Which is how young women in 14th century Flanders found themselves doing less chatting and more spinning, while someone from the linen guild squinted disapprovingly through a dusty curtain. The wheel itself came in many flavors. There was the great wheel, tall and dramatic, requiring the spinner to walk back and forth, useful when one had a castle hallway lying idle. Then came the Saxony wheel, small and cozy, perfect for cramming beside your favorite tapestried armchair. These designs didn't emerge all at once. They evolved, like particularly cooperative fungi, across cities and centuries. In India, the charkha, an elegant hand-cranked spinning wheel, was already humming softly by the time Europe was still arguing about windmill patents and who had stolen whom's ale recipe. The charkha would later become a political symbol under Gandhi, but even centuries earlier it represented independence and the virtue of self-spun industry. And all this before breakfast. Let's not forget the yarn itself. Fine worsted wool for the highborn, rough scratchy flax for the village priest who refused to dress like a normal person. Europeans learned new spinning techniques from their Arab and Persian neighbors, with whom they traded, squabbled, and argued for several pleasant centuries. Historians sometimes use the word cross-pollination, which sounds more botanical than it should, but neatly sums up how Mediterranean culture kept borrowing and tweaking technologies just enough to call them their own. With the spinning wheel now a household staple, women especially began to dominate the textile labor force, not just in cottages, but in the burgeoning urban workshops. Records from 14th century Italy reveal guilds of female spinners, spinning wool with such ferocity that someone probably suggested giving them battle flags. Surprisingly, that didn't happen, though their economic power grew stitch by stitch. In literature and art, the spinning wheel became more than a tool. It was a symbol, one that slipped easily between sacred and domestic realms. In Christian imagery, the Virgin Mary is sometimes shown spinning thread as a metaphor of devotion. In medieval romance, heroines spun golden silk while worrying about knights with impressive mustaches and truly horrible survival skills. As we ease deeper into the twilight of our tale, the spinning wheel hums away quietly, a metronome marking one of the slowest industrial upheavals in human history. Soon, its humble rotation will form the foundation for even grander machinery, ones that clacked, hissed, and roared with steam and ambition. But for now, it turns softly, like a lullaby made of wool. Let us drift onward together, toward the next thread in the loom of history, where yarn begins to take shape, not as raw material, but as identity itself. In the quiet thrum of Mesopotamian evenings, as the tigress whispered softly to the reeds and the stars blinked lazily above baked clay roofs, a curious revolution was weaving its way into history, quite literally. Looms, once mere stretches of wood and string, were becoming mighty instruments of bureaucracy. Yes, bureaucracy. Leave it to ancient civilizations to take fiber arts and turn them into paperwork. You see, by the time city-states like Ur and Lagash were humming along with temples, taxes, and a priesthood fond of extremely long titles, textile production had become an economic engine. Spindles and warp-weighted looms were not just tools. They were the spreadsheets of their time. Inventories of fibers, lists of workers, records of who owed how many tunics to the gods or to pavilion number 4, all woven with astonishing precision. This was less of a quaint cottage industry and more of a highly structured enterprise. Temple economies managed the distribution of wool, the allocation of labor, and presumably the daily complaints from weavers about thread tension. Long before tailors worried about fitting royal derriere into courtly trousers, these early administrators were worried about getting enough flax into the hands of skilled hands. Now, if you're imagining a room filled with grey-bearded scribes, plotting wool quotas by oil lamp, well, you're almost there. But many of the textile labourers were women, often temple servants or dependents pressed into service, some with skilled hands, others with a 1,000-yard stare from counting fibres all day. All contributed to a textile economy that contradicted the idea that ancient societies were simple. These folks had inventory lists that would make a modern tax auditor weep into their herbal tea. Imagine, if you will, a temple warehouse filled with baskets of dyed thread, golden labels hung on cords identifying royal deliveries, and a very annoyed overseer muttering about someone mixing up Caravan 6's tunics with the ceremonial undergarments of the high priest. A logistical headache wrapped in linen and tied off with woolen twine. But, oh, the organization. Cuneiform tablets tracked it all with the flair of a modern spreadsheet, minus the crashing software. They tallied linen contributions, calculated monthly loom output quotas, and even measured the exact length of yarn dispensed per shift. If you wonder who invented micromanagement, the answer may lie between 2 receipts for goat wool and an overdue shipment of reed baskets. Even dyed textiles took on a tangled thread of meaning. Blue, often made from the indigo plant that ruined many knuckles before it ever met a garment, was a symbol of status. Purple, that required murex shells, which meant someone had to stand knee-deep in saltwater peeling snails for pigment. A fine tunic was no random fashion statement. It represented significant labor, a bit of chemistry, and something that definitely smelled bad during production. And so weaving, while mundane in one sense, actually reveals a striking tapestry of social and economic complexity. Every warp and weft line represented not only textile construction, but also layers of caste, duty, sacred debt, and somewhat exasperated logistics managers trying to keep up with the growing imaginary empire of cloth. As the stars turned lazily above Sumerian rooftops and the looms creaked softly into the night, dreams fluttered like moths around oil lamps. A spindle, the humble whirligig of fiber arts, could contain the weight of an economy within its spiraling twist. What may have begun as a practical craft was now entwined with theology, taxation, and identity. And little did those silent weavers know, their efforts would stitch the first true fabrics of civilization. And our tale, like the 6th thread in a 12-thread braid, is about to tighten once more. Let's gently turn now, past ziggurats, reeds, and ledgers, and follow the whisper of linen across a different ancient land. And now, a gentle rustle of pages through time brings us to a curious moment in textile history. One scented faintly of goat hair and political compromise. Let's drift softly into the lands of Persia, where kings ruled, poets dreamed in rhyming couplets, and the hum of the loom echoed through ancient bazaars like lullabies whispered in silk and spice. In the heart of the Achaemenid Empire, yes, that sprawling, sandal-wearing superpower that once stretched from the Indus Valley to the Aegean Sea, textiles were more than simple cloth. They were currency, connection, and occasionally fire hazards. You see, Persia was deeply fond of its weavers. So fond, in fact, that the government recruited entire villages to specialize in weaving certain kinds of fabric. You there? A satrap might declare with profound enthusiasm. You'll be doing fine-spun wool. And you over there, yes, the fellow with no shoes. You'll stick to linen or face 37 questions about your loyalty to the empire. But it wasn't tyranny. Not quite. It was more like gentle imperial suggestion. An early form of textile zoning, perhaps, like a homeowners association, if the association was led by King Darius and came with its own army of bureaucrats and bearded inspectors. Now, to truly appreciate Persian weaving, one must understand the satrapal tribute system. Do try to keep your yawn stifled. This is about to get thrilling in the most bedtimey sort of way. Each province of the empire contributed goods to the royal treasury. Some sent gold, some sent spices, some sent horses who clearly wished they hadn't been volunteered. But textiles were a prized part of the tribute. Bales of embroidered cloth, fine robes, and patterned rugs made the long and dusty trip to Persepolis, so that royal feet could ignore perfectly decent stone floors in favor of something soft, expensive, and preferably imported. In this imperial traffic of fabric, Persian satraps became accidental fashionistas. There are records, delightfully dry records, scratched into cuneiform tablets that describe annual tributes featuring 100 white linen tunics, 200 embroidered cloaks from Sogdiana, and mysteriously, 43 towels marked with the lion. What the lion marked, or why it needed 43 towels, remains a mystery best solved by dreams. The Persians also valued dye like poets value metaphors. One especially prized colour was Persian blue, a heavenly hue meant to rival the lapis lazuli stones of Bactria or the melancholy in Scheherazada's eyes. These colours could cost more than a goat, a tent, and probably the affections of your neighbour's second cousin. But dye, even in its glorious purples and oceanic blues, had its occupational hazards. The fixatives used often involved urine, fermented plants, or, brace yourself, snail glands. Imagine, if you will, the poor apprentice whose task was to coax vivid dye from rows of disgruntled mollusks. It builds character, someone in charge surely said, while holding a perfumed handkerchief over their nose. Still, Persian weaving was not solely a matter of imperial display. Textiles were woven into every corner of daily life. Nomadic herders, for instance, wove felted rugs directly onto the floors of their tents for warmth, insulation, and stylish conversation starters. Ah yes, one might say, reclining on a rug. My cousin traded 3 goats and an argument for this piece. Very exclusive. Of course, in a world before fast fashion, creating a single garment could take weeks. In villages nestled near the Zagros Mountains, grandmothers passed down weaving patterns through generations like secret family spells. Hexes of hexagons and colour-blocked heirlooms, shared at the speed of love and familiarity. The looms. Vertical looms were a favourite, especially in villages where horizontal looms would simply confuse the goats. Women, often the primary weavers, would sit at these sturdy contraptions for long hours, their hands dancing across threads as if composing a lullaby you could wear. With each pass of the shuttle, they stitched together whispers of ancestry, practicality, and beauty. Now, as stars began to glint softly above Persepolis and the desert cooled for the night, the royal weavers retired silently. Their day's work, a blend of toil and artistry, would soon become gowns for the elite, banners for ceremony, or perhaps just a merchant's cloak fluttering in the breeze as he crossed the empire's starlit roads. But far from the grandeur and golden palaces, deep in a quiet tent beneath the tapestry sky, a young child settled on a woven mat, tracing the patterns as if they were maps to dreams. And while she drifted into sleep, woolen threads cradling her side, another story spun quietly, waiting to unfurl in the silk-lined corridors of a distant empire. There, as we'll soon discover, weaving found a luxurious flourish in the most unexpected of Roman places. It was in the ancient city of Miletus, nestled along the Ionian coast, like a well-placed decorative tassel, that weaving stopped being merely a chore and ascended into a kind of slow-motion art form. The Greeks, with their sandaled swagger and penchant for naming everything in sight, were especially fond of loom-based labour. In Miletus, they didn't just weave cloth. They wove status, ceremony, and the occasional tragic metaphor. Now, let's take a moment to appreciate that before high fashion houses and polyester blends, a toga was the ultimate fashion statement. Draping yourself in fabric wasn't just fashion. It was a whole philosophical whimsy. The more layers you had, the more important you presumably were. And nothing said, "I've been to the public forum 3 times this week," like a fresh, finely woven Milesian tunic. In homes across the region, you could hear the gentle clink of weights from vertical looms echoing alongside the muted grumble of philosophers disputing the nature of reality. While Plato speculated about the forms, someone not too far away was likely beating weft into warp with a wooden sword-like tool called a baton. wondering if perhaps reality was just a tangled heap of threads waiting for form. This was no idle woman's work, however quaint that might sound. The household loom was a proper piece of infrastructure, taller than a goat and heavier than most husbands. It was often set up in a semi-sacred part of the house, like a shrine, albeit one where the goddess of productivity held dominion and occasionally lost the scissors. The process itself was impressively ritualistic. First came the warping, stretching the vertical threads into tension, like the universe before a big bang of textile blossoming. The Greeks were slightly obsessive about tension. Not just emotional tension, they had entire myths about family members turning into birds, but also literal tension, where string needed to be pulled just tight enough, not to cause loom-based despair. Once that was set, the weaver, usually a woman of staggering patience, would spend hours throwing the weft thread back and forth, building up fabric row by row. It wasn't so much weaving as weaving yourself into the garment through accumulated size. Legendary patience. If Olympic judges had seen what these women did with thread, there would have been a podium category for loftiest use of monotony. And if you think textile work was purely domestic, allow me to tempt your imagination with a little woven politics. The peplos woven annually by Athenian maidens for Athena was not only a sign of civic devotion, it was an early form of municipal branding. Picture it, a giant robe, hand-woven and paraded through the streets, placed lovingly on the statue of a helmeted goddess with surprisingly broad shoulders. That's right, city-sponsored textile pageantry. Move over, Times Square billboards. And do you know who else found weaving utterly riveting? Homer. Not Homer Simpson, though he did have moments of quiet thread-based frustration, but ancient Homer, the bard of bards. In the Odyssey, Penelope preserved her honor and delayed remarriage for 20 years simply by weaving a shroud during the day and sneakily unweaving it at night. Theseus had his labyrinth. Penelope had her wool. This tale, stitched tightly to the loom of ancient domestic life, made weaving suddenly mysterious, even subversive. Each shuttle passed was a message. Try asking me about my marital status. Go ahead. Penelope was ghosting suitors before texting existed, all with a loom and an iron will. But let's not forget that ancient Greece, for all its glory, wasn't overflowing with cashmere. Most of the weaving was done with wool, scratchy, earnest, and occasionally smelling of sheep in the rain. Linens, prized for their breathability, had to be imported or grown where the climate kindly obliged. So what did this mean for your typical Greek citizen? It meant wool in winter and vague lamentations come summer. Still, their ingenuity deserves a small reverent nod. Patterns were developed not through dye, but through intricate changes in thread color and weaving technique. Like pixel art, but with heavier consequences and much less shouting. So the next time you slip on a pair of socks, or bemoan the tag itching at the back of your neck, spare a small thought for an Ionian woman in 600 BCE, weaving by the sunlight that filtered through an open courtyard, preparing to wrap her entire family in an argument with gravity and wind. And as the gentle rhythm of her shuttle slows for the evening, so too does our thread tonight. Just in time to glimpse what clever hands in other lands would do with a bit of fibre and a stretch of patience. Somewhere between the rustle of linen and the whisper of a spinning wheel humming in the distance, we find ourselves in the quiet heart of imperial Rome, where the threads of textile craftsmanship were as tightly woven as a toga on a senator's formal day out. The Romans, those perennial overachievers in sandals, didn't just take over half the known world. they also took a shining interest in making sure their tunics didn't fall apart in front of an amphitheater crowd. You see, togas weren't just fashion statements. They were small architectural feats of fabric, custom engineered for public lounging, judicial grandstanding, and occasionally dramatic fainting. And that meant textiles needed to be more than serviceable. They needed to impress. Now imagine you're a Roman matron, dressed in a fine stola as you step into the domus atrium. The sunlight dapples through the peristyle swaying plants, and beyond, tucked within the villa's walls, is the textrina, the weaving room, a symbol of virtue and industry. This was where household magic happened, a chorus of spindles spun by handmaidens' daughters, and occasionally a surprisingly dexterous uncle with a flair for weft and warp artistry. Looms stood tall like quiet sentinels, vertical looms to be precise, taller than a legionnaire's patience, and often wide enough to require teamwork. Linen was common, made from flax plants that Roman farmers coaxed lovingly or impatiently into bloom. Wool came from sheep clipping and strategic blinking to avoid eye contact with disgruntled ewes. And cotton? Not quite fashionable, yet. The Romans had heard of it, of course. They referred to it as exotic fluff from the East, and treated it with both suspicion and mild interest, the same way your grandmother might peer at a vegan casserole. Silk, however, was the diva of the fabric world. Imported with reverence along the Silk Road, it travelled farther than most Roman legions cared to march and carried with it an aura of luxury drenched in mystery. Silk was so prized that the Senate naturally tried to ban it. Too see-through, they huffed. Un-Roman, they added. But do you know what they didn't do? Stop wearing it. Senators were many things, but hypocrites with great taste in textiles. Absolutely. Dig a little deeper, and you'll find textile work wasn't all noble matrons and high-end tunics. There were fulling mills too, where the real textile drama unfolded. Fullers, those tireless cleaners of cloth, would stomp on fabric in large vats, using a solution known as fuller's earth. And, well, stale urine. Yes, you heard right. Ancient laundry day was not for the faint of nostril. The Romans even had public collection pots for this golden ingredient, with the Emperor Vespasian famously taxing it. When criticized for monetizing human odor, he's rumored to have held a coin to his nose and said, "Money doesn't stink." That, dear listener, is where functional governance meets olfactory denial. Still, the final fabrics that emerged from this complex, slightly aromatic journey were nothing short of impressive. Dyed robes glowed in imperial purple, reserved strictly for emperors and the dangerously ambitious. Other colors, like madder red or woad blue, were more democratic, splashing across markets, homes, and temples. Mortals of all classes wore their status stitched into their sleeves, with patterns sometimes echoing a family crest, a regional style, or just a stubborn weaver's eccentric flair. Textile shops, known as officini, buzzed with customers poking, prodding, and pretending to understand thread count. Seamstresses haggled politely, and sometimes impolitely, depending on who insulted their hand-stitching. And tailors, those ancient couturiers, could transform rolls of fabric into garments that clung, draped, and flattered, all without the aid of elastic waistbands or stretchy denim. Miraculous. And yet, for all its grandeur, the Roman textile world remained a deeply human affair, tied to family, tradition, and the quiet rhythm of rinsing, spinning, weaving, and stitching. A language of care, unspoken but deeply felt in every hemline and household. As twilight dips behind the narrow alleyways of a Roman insula, The last flickers of lamplight glint off a spinning spindle, still slowly turning in some third-floor window. The city hums cloaked in tunics and twilight, its citizens wrapped in fabrics woven by generations past, woven slowly, methodically, lovingly. Tomorrow, across the empire, another loom will creak, another roll of wool will unfurl. But for now, take a deep breath of lavender-scented linen and let your thoughts drift, not unlike a silken thread floating gently through lamp smoke, toward another curious corner of the ancient world, waiting just beyond the warp. By the 3rd century BCE, the Roman Empire had come to realize 3 important truths: gladiators, garum, that famously fishy sauce, and that a toga wasn't so much a garment as it was a social experiment in patience and folding. But while the world marveled at Rome's bathhouses and legions, something quieter, softer, and infinitely more wrinkle-prone was hard at work in the background. A textile system so elaborate it could only be improved by an empire-wide spreadsheet. Let's drift gently now into the gentle hum of Roman domestic industry, where in the shadow of marble columns and crumbling aqueducts, the loom sang its steady lullaby. Roman cloth-making was not an idle affair for passing afternoons. Oh no, it was the relentless responsibility of women, primarily enslaved women or those modest matronae, with a particularly keen eye for thread tension. The ideal Roman woman was one who, in the Latin phrase domum servavit, lanam fecit, kept the house and made the wool. Essentially, the ancient Roman version of she had it all. In villas, both modest and grand, rooms were dedicated to spinning and weaving. A small wooden spindle whirled in the hands of many, turning tufts of wool into thread with more grace than a Senate speech. The wool itself, sourced from sheep who, one suspects, had no earthly idea their life's purpose was to adorn senators and serve as Roman fashion statements. They grazed innocently across the Italian countryside, completely unaware that their legacy would involve being bleached, dyed, and eventually worn by a man with a name like Gaius Pompilius Maximus and a habit of loudly complaining about toga pleats. Now, the looms of Rome, vertical in design, stood tall like quiet sentries. Warp threads were stretched like harp strings down the frame, and weft threads were carefully woven through them with a shuttle. It is perhaps the only instance where the word weft is both accurate and soporific. To visualize this, imagine you're in a sun-dappled atrium just beyond the bustling forum, the scent of olive oil lingering in the air. Women sit upon stools, deft hands guiding threads while nearby a pan of lentils burbles softly for supper. A small terracotta oil lamp flickers. Even the flame seems hushed by the rhythm of weaving. Linen, derived from flax, was also produced with almost ascetic discipline. The process to extract usable fiber from flax makes modern tax forms feel breezy in comparison. After the flax was harvested, it was soaked until the stalks rotted slightly, a delightful phase charmingly called retting, then scraped, pounded, combed, and spun into thread. If you were particularly unlucky and wealthy, you might be supervising this while hosting a rather dour dinner party. And let's not forget Rome's love affair with purple. The Tyrian purple dye, sourced from the murex sea snail, took tens of thousands of mollusks to dye a few inches of fabric. It was so precious that its use was reserved for emperors and gods, or people who thought very highly of themselves and happened to own a fleet. Who knew that the apex of fashion rested in the goopy innards of a Mediterranean sea mollusk? But textile fabrication didn't end with cloth. There was full on-garb strategy. Togas, for instance, weren't sewn. They were draped with drama and complaint. A proper toga was a vast woolen half-circle, roughly the size of a minor curtain, that had to be folded just so, under one arm and over the opposite shoulder. It had to ripple in the right places, much like an expensive tablecloth artfully placed on a windy day. This was not a garment for movement or practicality. It was a status symbol that said, I can afford to not do manual labor and also to trip stylishly on stairs. Underneath it all, quite literally, Romans wore simpler garments, tunics, stitched rectangles of wool or linen, often in undyed off-white shades that we today generously label oatmeal in expensive catalogues. Children, slaves, and laborers wore these daily, and weavers produced them in bulk, reinforcing the fabric with tidily hand-woven borders known as clavii. A society so bound up in its threads gives us not only a glimpse of its economy and class structure, but also its metaphors. To spin a tale or weave a story are phrases that owe their roots to this exact age when storytelling and yarn-making were sometimes done by the same person, albeit one likely seated on a low stool beside the hearth. And as the Roman day faded, after the duties tended, the looms quieted, and the oils extinguished, the fabric of the empire lay folded neatly in chests, scented faintly with lavender or possibly dust. In the soft hush of a twilight villa, with distant sandals echoing down the tiled halls, the spinning ceased, and the stories waited for morning. But beyond Italia's coasts and grand olive groves further east, the threads of civilization were being dyed with other colors, colors of silk, and kingdoms even older. As twilight descended over the dusty silhouettes of ancient looms, somewhere in the cradle of old Anatolia, a curious transformation was underway, not in the fabrics themselves, but in the minds of those who wove them. The humble textile, once merely a swath of function, had begun its ascent into the shimmering clouds of mystique and meaning. This is where weaving met symbolism, and it was, as they say, a tangled affair. By now, the weavers of yore had gone far beyond simple warp and weft. These were no longer just bits of sheep fluff, crisscrossed for modesty's sake. Textiles had become carriers of stories, secrets, and ceremonial flair. A tunic might say, I am powerful. A robe might whisper, I am divine. And a loincloth, well, it might just mumble, laundry day is overdue. In many early civilizations, a well-woven cloth wasn't merely proof you had thumbs. It was a passport to symbolism, status, and the occasional spiritual enlightenment. Among the ancient Egyptians, for instance, those lovers of linen and long shadows, the way a piece of cloth was folded or fringed could whisper volumes about one's rank in the grand social pyramid. Linen, particularly the bleached kind, was so prized that it sometimes featured in burial rites, wrapped tightly around mummies like a posthumous spa treatment. Meanwhile, over on the sun-kissed isles of the Aegean, the Minoans were indulging in their own textile theatrics. Their garments billowed and pleated like theatrical curtains, revealing that someone, somewhere, had not only mastered the loom, but also acquired a flair for theatrical suspense. Their female garments, in particular, raised eyebrows, both then and now, with flowing shapes, voluminous skirts, and bodices that offered a rather candid view of Minoan anatomy. Whether it was a religious rite, a fashionable choice, or just very warm weather, no one dared say. The looms weren't talking, but it was within the elite walls of Mesopotamian courts that cloth transformed into coded language. The Assyrians and Babylonians, those sharp cheekboned micromanagers of the ancient Near East, had a keen eye for textiles that glittered with woven silver and dyed wool the color of crushed pomegranates. High priests were swathed in elaborate vestments that declared, "I speak to the gods," while lower-ranking officials looked on in itchy envy from their coarser tunics. And then, of course, there was Tyrian purple, the most passive-aggressively exclusive dye in antiquity. Extracted from the mucous glands of tiny sea snails, who had, quite frankly, done nothing to deserve such attention, this royal hue was restricted to elites. If you were caught wearing it without noble credentials, the punishment was slightly more intense than a stern look from your grandmother. Think more along the lines of public humiliation and possible disembowelment. Fashion enforcement was a serious business. Even in the highlands of the Andes, long before llamas became adorable memes, Andean weavers tucked symbolism into every tightly interlocked thread. These cloths weren't just for wearing. They were for worship, trade, even diplomacy. A well-woven textile could be offered to the gods or given to a warring neighbor as a token of peace, or perhaps as a subtle suggestion to please stop invading for 5 minutes. Color schemes, patterns, and even the thread count. Yes, ancient thread counters existed, were all signals in a complex language that modern eyes might miss. A zigzag pattern might symbolize water. A red stripe might denote clan loyalty. Or it might just be what happens when a llama sneezes near a dye pot. Interpret cautiously. In some cultures, like the Yunus nomads of Central Asia, each knot in a rug held generations of stories, bound snug by calloused hands that knew both camel fur and family lore. They believed that a loom itself was a kind of sacred space. A grandmother's lap stretched across wood and wool. The weaver sang to the threads as she worked, not because she was trying to go viral on ancient TikTok, but because the song was part of the pattern. It settled into the cloth like warmth from a hearth. And so, from pharaohs wrapped in whispers of power to Andean chiefs depicted through alpaca-laced hieroglyphics, the ancient world wove fabrics not only to cover their limbs, but to clothe their identities. Textiles, once the wallpaper of humanity, had become its autobiography. Drifting onward, threads of meaning still dangling in the twilight, we now prepare to wander into the realm of wool diplomacy and fiber-fueled economic collapse. Yes, really. Just wait until we unspool what happens when an empire bets its treasury on a very fluffy gamble. Despite what one might imagine, the weaving of cloth was never a solitary or solemn affair, tucked away in shadowy huts with only the shuffle of threads and the wistful sighs of weavers for company. No, in the rich tapestry of ancient guilds and workshops, textile weaving was downright social. Positively bustling, in fact. Think of it as the coffee house of craftsmanship, only with more spinning wheels and fewer gossipy philosophers. In first-century Roman towns, we find the fullonica, the ancient equivalent of your neighborhood artisanal dry cleaner and fabric finisher. The fullers, who owned or worked in these establishments, were not merely responsible for washing and thickening fabrics. No, they were the final act in the great theatrical production of textile creation. And while they took their job seriously, they still had time for a bit of song, a bit of sweat, and perhaps the occasional, very questionable vat of fermenting urine. But we'll come back to that. The fullonica was often a 2-story building, stone-walled and open-roofed in places. On any given day, one might find the air thick with steam and the unmistakable aroma of ammonia, along with the hearty conversation of workers elbow-deep in wool. These weren't gloomy souls. They stomped on fabric with rhythmic determination, singing songs to keep time, half work chant, half musical footbath. A phalonica was where woolen cloth went to get fluffed, scrubbed, dyed, beaten senseless, stretched straight, and finally, gratefully, pressed flat. The employees, often a combination of enslaved labourers and hired hands, all of whom knew the value of teamwork and strong calves. It was a place where your co-worker might not know your birthday, but they definitely knew the tensile strength of your ankle tendons. Now, part of their process, brace yourself, relied on a steady supply of human urine. Yes, as unlikely as it might sound to the modern nostril, our Roman friends cheerfully collected the neighbourhood's liquid offerings in public pots. These public containers, known as urina receptacula, were left discreetly, or not so discreetly, on street corners. Once filled, the contents were hauled to the phalonica, where urine's natural ammonia gave wool a proper zingy cleansing. Strangely efficient, deeply unpleasant. But here's where history really likes to chuckle. Emperor Vespasian introduced a urine tax in the late 1st century CE. Yes, a tax on, well, peeing. Money was collected from those who bought urine for industrial purposes, especially the fullones. When criticized, Vespasian famously held up a coin to his nose and declared, "Pecunia non olet," money does not stink, which, to be fair, is only true when you're not the one laundering fabric in pungent puddles of civic generosity. Guilds of weavers and fullers eventually became so prominent that they gained official recognition. The collegia, as the Romans called their professional groups, were given certain privileges, and over time, even had religious overtones. Some placed shrines to Minerva, the goddess of wisdom and crafts, within their shops, perhaps to bless their weaving, or perhaps to politely distract her from noticing the less than divine aroma. Social status among textile workers varied wildly. In Egypt, for instance, textile production frequently overlapped with temple life, where priests and priestesses administered vast weaving workshops. In Greece, hand weaving remained a noble domestic art, often performed by women of high status. But in Rome, fabric finishing was a man's world, grimy and prestigious in its own peculiar way. Whatever the culture, what unites them all is that the thread never existed in isolation. Every strand passed through many hands, gatherers, spinners, dyers, weavers, fullers. Each stage a step in the cloth's long journey from raw fibre to finished garment, from sheepish wool to imperial toga. Even the simplest tunic wandered through a gauntlet of gossip, salt, soapwort, songs, and sore backs. It was a moving mosaic of lives interwoven with the very threads they touched, steam curling into the morning air, hammering feet echoing through stone corridors, and somewhere, someone carefully pressing a hem against a smooth stone, humming off-key and dreaming of dinner. There are whispers, of course, of trade secrets protected with astonishing tenacity, mysterious paste recipes, dye combinations, and the ideal fabric blessing incantation muttered under one's breath. But we'll save the more alchemical side of the textile arts for another very quiet, very well-laundered evening. In the later silk-swathed centuries of ancient Rome, textile weaving had grown from a cottage craft into a soft, society-wide obsession. While senators draped their philosophies in togas and emperors wrapped tyranny in purple dye, it was the humble fabric beneath that held the true threads of the empire. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the labyrinthine insulae of urban Rome. Those densely packed apartment buildings where, amid the scent of olives, fish sauce, and occasional structural collapse, lived the spinners and dyers of the Roman working class. There, in rooms so small they made modern studio apartments look decadent, Women twisted the fibers of sheep's wool between their fingers with stoic precision, their drop spindles humming like sleepy bees on a midsummer afternoon. The Roman poet Propertius once swooned in a verse over how his beloved Cynthia preferred carding wool to going to parties, a woman after our own sleepy hearts. And it was hardly an isolated sentiment. Roman society admired the virtue of the domestic spinner, elevating the loom from a tool of labor to a symbol of modest femininity. The spinning woman, her eyes hooded with focus, reclining by the hearth. It sounds almost peaceful until you realize she was likely churning out yards of fabric to clothe half her extended family, her in-laws, and any toga-wearing philosopher who dropped by, waxing poetic about stoicism. The fiber of choice in Rome was wool, abundant, pliable, and infinitely dyeable. Romans raised entire armies of sheep, patrolling the hills of the Italian countryside like small, woolly militias. Linen made from flax was also used, arriving with cooler comfort for summer wear, though it required more work per toga meter. Silk, of course, was the luxury reserved for those who didn't blink at entire fortunes sewn into their cuffs, imported along the silk roads like secret treasure handled by many sweaty hands and suspicious customs inspectors. Raw silk threads winked with decadent mystery. Scandalized senators even tried to ban it on moral grounds, claiming it was far too sheer and might tempt people to enjoy themselves. But textile weaving in Rome wasn't just a women's affair. Ancient guilds of fullers and dyers, known collectively as fullones, took over once the fabric was spun. These men operated fulling workshops where cloth was cleaned, thickened, and dyed, using techniques best described as unbelievably inventive, occasionally grotesque. Chief among their supplies was urine. Yes, you heard correctly. The delightful smell wafting from a fuller's workshop was nothing less than nature's most generously donated ammonium. Roman citizens were encouraged, publicly and proudly, to urinate into amphorae for collection. Emperor Vespasian even taxed the stuff, a truly golden empire. The fuller would soak the fabric in this fragrant solution, then stomp it underfoot in a process called treading. Imagine a contemporary day spa, but with foot paddling, pee, and profoundly less enya. Once thoroughly softened and purified, the cloth was rinsed, hopefully well, and hung to dry in Roman sunshine, which I imagine was both glorious and urgently necessary. As for the dyeing, the Romans outdid themselves in their pursuit of elite color palettes. Tyrian purple, derived from the glands of thousands of murex snails, remained the color of power, wealth, and a certain disregard for mollusk well-being. Greener options came from woad and weld plants, while bright reds were whipped up from madder roots or cochineal beetles, crushed to oblivion in the name of fashion. When you sported crimson stripes on your toga, you weren't just making a statement. You were also wearing the exoskeletons of hundreds of beetles, a talking point at any dinner party. Of course, fashion wasn't static. Toga styles shifted more often than you might think. Over time, the toga became so massively voluminous and unmanageable that it was said people began hiring professional toga arrangers to help them get dressed in the morning. An ancient version of personal stylists clutching pins and muttering dramatically about drape volume. Weaving by hand still remained a domestic art, even as Roman industry grew. Large-scale workshops, sometimes staffed by slaves, sometimes by free laborers, produced simple tunics by the dozen. Soldiers needed uniforms after all, and you can't march to Gaul wearing nothing but civic pride. Through it all, the clack of loom weights, the shuffle of spindled hands, and the chemical waft of fullers' shops hummed beneath the marble grandeur of the empire. Rome marched, dictated, conspired and conquered, but always upon fabric first spun in the quiet corners of kitchens and courtyards. And as the empire exhaled and shifted toward twilight, so too did its textiles become more than just function. They became memory, a record woven not only with dyed threads, but with the lives of those who gently, patiently spun them. Let us now drift with them toward another loom, one even more ancient, waiting quietly in the desert haze. In the dusky folds of history, just as the last rays of the afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the cobbled streets of medieval Bruges, something quite unexpected happened in the world of weaving. People got organized. Yes, dear listener, we've arrived at the point where weaving, arguably one of the slowest and most horizontal of occupations, sparked the rise of guilds, the weavers' guilds to be precise. Calm and dignified associations of people whose entire job was to make the business of looping thread over and under other thread mind-numbingly professional. Imagine a group of stoic Flemish citizens gathering not to drink ale or gossip about who dropped their cheese in the canal again, but to discuss appropriate loom etiquette, acceptable widths of wool, and whether someone had improperly sheared their sheep in spring. These guilds were not just clubs. They were the regulatory bodies of textile righteousness. And if you thought medieval bureaucracy was boring, prepare to have your previously unbent shuttle knocked askew. You see, weaving had become serious business. No more was it left to the rotating moods of a village grandmother and the quality of her eyesight. No, rules were drawn up, standards were standardized. An apprentice couldn't just become a weaver. He had to apprentice for years, learning how not to drop his thread and how to not accidentally weave a chicken into a tapestry. Guild meetings likely weren't terribly exciting, barring the occasional scandal where someone used 2-ply thread in a 1-ply zone. But what they lacked in pizzazz, they made up for in social power. In cities like Florence, Lyon, and London, these guilds became the gatekeepers of wealth, fashion, and absolutely riveting discussions about warp tension. Let's float now to 13th century London, where the Worshipful Company of Weavers, the oldest recorded City of London livery company, was already something of a celebrity among municipal organizations. Their banner depicted a loom, naturally, supported by 2 fantastically bored-looking cherubs. And heaven help anyone who tried to sell a bolt of cloth without their blessing. Punishments range from fines to public shaming to, if particularly scandalous, being forced to wear a badly threaded tunic in the town square, a punishment that caused both embarrassment and mild chafing. But not all was solemn and stuffy. The guilds also hosted feasts. Weavers, after all, needed sustenance after hours spent hunched over their looms, muttering at tangles and sighing dramatically when a warped thread snapped. These suppers were as close as guild members got to letting down their guard, filled with rye bread, modest ale, and enthusiastic debates over the superiority of flax over nettle fibre. Spoiler, it was always flax. Nettles may be plentiful, but they're not exactly cuddly. Through the rhythmic clatter of looms and the slow accumulation of cloth, the weavers wove more than fabric. They wove status, roles, and community. Within their world, you were either a master, an apprentice, or someone who had severely underestimated how long it takes to make a proper tunic by hand. Even noblemen needed they who weave, and oh, how the nobility loved a good bolt of brocade. Silk brocades, imported sometimes from the East and laboriously woven with gold-wrapped threads, became less garments and more walking, talking, bragging rights. Ah, yes, a baron might say, swirling his goblet dramatically. My doublet, Turkish silk, Flemish weave, and spindled only at dawn under the light of a pious moon. Guilds ensured all of this was possible by regulating who could weave what and where and whether their spinster aunt was qualified to produce sleeve linings. The guilds made textile quality more predictable, which, in turn, made the medieval shopping experience far less of a roulette wheel. Of course, not everyone appreciated the guild model. Some called it restrictive. Others, especially those with looms just outside the city walls, grumbled about the tyranny of standard sizes. But the guilds endured, their looms clicking away like a sleepy metronome, steady as a lullaby spun from flax and patience. And so, as the candle gutters low in our imaginary weaver's workshop, with its bundles of carded wool stacked like sleepy clouds along the beams, we lend an ear to the gentle creak of spinning wheels and the muted gossip of apprentices. The air smells of lanolin and barley soup. The loom is still. The master weaver yawns quietly, dreams of gold-threaded tabards dancing just beyond reach. But don't drift fully off just yet. For beyond the comfort of the guild hall, there lies a curious tale of one of weaving's most surprising side effects, something no amount of guild regulation could contain: the spreading of secrets by silk. Perhaps there's no greater testament to the triumph of patience than the medieval tapestry guilds of Flanders. That, or the fact that people voluntarily wore wool doublets in July. But let's not rush the weft. Tonight, we slowly pull the thread on a particular moment in textile history, when cloth was not merely stitched, it was stained with power, pride, and the periodic complaint of quite pokey needles. In the cosy, cobbled cities like Bruges and Ghent, around the 14th century, there blossomed a golden age of textile production. Picture the scene: narrow alleyways, the gentle clatter of looms echoing through half-timbered houses, and the far-off mumble of a merchant muttering about dye prices while sipping a suspiciously weak ale. Flanders had found its niche. Wool would arrive in bales from England, usually carried by overworked pack animals with philosophical eyes, and was transformed into fine cloth, dyed in vivid colours with natural pigments squeezed from insects, plants, and sheer chemical bravery. Cochineal for scarlets, woad for blues, weld for yellows. Truly, these weren't mere colours. They were lifelong relationships. One didn't wear blue. One committed to it. The weavers themselves belonged to guilds, ancient medieval unions that were part social club, part quality control committee, and part secret society for people with strong opinions on thread tension. They had special passwords, elaborate ceremonies, and rules so complex they made juridical papyrus scrolls look breezy. There was even a weaver's hall, where decisions were made and disputes settled. Picture 3 elder weavers sitting at a long table, squinting at a poorly sewn tunic like judges reviewing a particularly underwhelming bake. Well, one might murmur, his selvage is straight, but his warp threads are frankly an embarrassment. Outside, apprentices scrub dye vats and practice the noble art of complaining in verse about cramped looms and chronic back pain. These young weavers in training, usually boys of around 12, were like medieval interns, underpaid, overtasked, and mysteriously covered in lanolin at all hours. The dyers, they were their own merry breed. Arm-deep in vats of colour, they wandered the streets in garments permanently tinged in hues of their trade, blues and purples, reds like pomegranate rinds. Their houses could often be sniffed before they were seen. Of course, competition among the textile towns didn't help the mood. Ghent looked down on Ypres, side-eyed Louvain, and everyone collectively snickered when Brussels claimed their linen could rival Flanders' fine wool. And as often happens when economics are involved, monarchs got interested. Kings realized that a well-dressed court cost a lot of gold, especially when cloth was imported. Better to control the source, they pondered, thus prompting both policy changes and occasionally continent-crossing battles fought indirectly over someone's favorite pair of breeches. Textiles became political. A bolt of cloth could represent not just luxury, but allegiance. Some dyes were even considered state secrets. The process for creating a certain imperial purple, locked tight within the bowels of Byzantine bureaucracy, somewhere between the Ministry of Pickled Figs and the Office of Ceremonial Beards. But back in Flanders, beyond the guilds and rivalries, the real magic still happened quietly, loom by loom, thread by thread. It was work that demanded rhythm, focus, artistry, and a tolerance for splinters. The click-clack of shuttles, the scent of wool warmed by oil lamps, the hush of a city gently swaddled in yarn. At night, the weavers would walk home through lantern-lit streets, finger joints creaking like old floorboards, minds tangled with dreams of more perfect patterns. The moon would catch on the rooftop gutters, and somewhere, a cat likely slept on a pile of felts, utterly unimpressed. Centuries later, museums would hang these tapestries with reverence, describing their symbolism, dedicating entire plaques to botanical scrolls and theological flourishes. But the weavers, if they could whisper through time, might say, "Oh, that part. We ran out of red and had extra green." And thus, a pomegranate became a hedgehog. In the invisible folds of cloth, between the warp's tension and the weft's wanderings, lives a legacy so humble yet so enduring. Each loop, each knot, carries the whisper of hands long gone, their laughter, their labor, their slightly exaggerated stories about how hard it used to be. And speaking of wanderings, there's a rather intriguing road ahead, leading to a distant land of even more curious textile traditions, where sand, silk, and stubborn camels had their own stories to tell. As the sun slipped lazily behind the crenellated roofs of a Mycenaean stronghold, threading golden rays through dust and goat hairs, the weavers gathered again. Their fingers, gnarled by craft and calmed by countless repetitions, resumed the ancient rhythm that had woven its way across centuries. Over, under, breathe, and again. The loom, still the same deceptively simple frame of wood and string since the days of Somber, stood like a silent metronome, ticking through time not by sound, but by fabric. Tonight, we drift toward the dye pots and delicacies of color, where textile weaving crossed paths with alchemy, fashion, and a mercantile misadventure or two. You see, in the ancient world, color wasn't just a matter of pigment. It was politics, prestige, and in one oddly specific Phoenician case, snail goo. Let's spiral ourselves delicately into the tale of Tyrian purple. Tyre, an ancient Phoenician port city that smelled faintly like rotting seafood and incredible profit margins. Tyrian purple was the crème de la crème of ancient dyes, extracted from the glands of the murex sea snail, a creature smaller than your pinky and vastly more valuable. It took roughly 250,000 snails to dye a single toga. The process was so fragrant, in the horrifying sense, that dyers were segregated to the outskirts of city life, partly for convenience and mostly for olfactory mercy. Imagine lounging in your marble villa wearing a cape that smells like an unintended aquarium experiment. But fashion, even then, was happy to suffer for beauty, or at least for status. The color didn't fade, and neither did its symbolism. Tyrian purple clung to emperors, bishops, and bureaucratic bigwigs across continents. By the time Rome came stomping onto the scene, the Senate actually restricted the color to imperial use. Wearing it without permission was the textile equivalent of treason. Imagine being tried by toga content. Elsewhere, other hues were busy marking their own cultural milestones. Ancient China, with its silken landscapes and dynastic flair, favored red, not just any red, but a bold, buoyant cinnabar, dragged from mercury ore and ground into powder by individuals who may or may not have signed up to glow before OSHA existed. Red symbolized vitality, happiness, weddings, and yes, even sleepy storytelling traditions centuries later. Meanwhile, in Egypt, the land of sand and eyeliner innovation, ochres and indigo, made regular appearances. The weavers there, often enslaved or conscripted into temple service, created linen garments so fine you could read ancient gossip through them. Pharaoh's beard seen at braiding salon again, perhaps. Dyeing was a deeply spiritual affair at times, especially when paired with ritual cloth production. In many cultures, weaving was a metaphor for life itself. Threads crossing, paths entwining, hands shaping destiny one shuttle pass at a time. Even the gods got involved. Athena, famously armed with a loom and a grudge, once challenged a mortal named Arachne to a weaving contest. Arachne won, but divine egos are notoriously fragile, and Athena turned her into the world's first spider, or perhaps the world's first textile-themed warning label. Across the Andes, the Inca wove tapestries of alpaca and vicuña wool, dyed in every hue the mountain offered up. Their dyes came from plants, insects, cochineal, beetle, and minerals, and their weave techniques were complex fractal dreams, charting cosmology and pride, dynasty and diplomacy. Back in the Old World, Europe's medieval dyers used madder root for red, woad for blue, and a variety of herbs, barks, and mysterious stains of unknown origin for everything in between. Dye recipes were trade secrets, handed down like family spells, along with instructions like boil for 3 days and hope it doesn't explode, or add urine for richness, though never explaining whose. Of course, dyeing wasn't always intentional. Sometimes fabric just picked things up, wine for instance, or battle. Many an archaeological find has been tinted by the drama of its final use. A splash of ash, a blush of something once crimson, now rust. Clothes, it seems, carried history as surely as any scroll. And so, as night deepens and the loom slows to a whisper, we find ourselves wrapped in colour, pulled through time not by war or empire, but by threads dyed with dreams, disasters, and occasionally fermented snails. Now, rest your mind like a distaff unburdened, and we'll ease onward toward the final fleeting fabric of our sleepy tapestry. And so, as we drift ever closer to the muted echo of history's heartbeat, we find ourselves in the final hush of an era spun from threads and ingenuity. The ancient world, with all its clacking looms and rustling fibers, begins to blur now into the twilight of memory, like a linen curtain sighing in a summer breeze. Let us end our tale where many ancient days met their dusk, in the quiet decline of the great empires and the gentle fading of crafts that once shaped the rhythms of daily life. For all the grandeur of pyramids and columns, it was the warp-weighted looms in the corners of dim, mud-plastered homes where the real magic took place. Empires rose and fell in the time it took a woman to spin flax into thread, and then they did it again. Eventually, that very flax would meet its reckoning with trousers. Yes, trousers. Fire the trumpets, release the doves, Pantaloons had arrived. It was the Romans who raised their imperial eyebrows at the flowing tunics of yore and began to embrace the stitched realm of bifurcated garments. The textile arts, ever adaptable and always practical, followed suit, quite literally. No longer was it enough to wrap oneself in a rectangle of wool and call it a day. Now, cloth had to shape itself around knees, elbows, fancy shoulder ornaments, and whatever decorative nonsense the upper class decided was in this century. The humble weavers, bless them, adjusted, always adjusting. From Mesopotamia to the banks of the Danube, they swapped old spindle whorls for newer frames, embraced the twill and the tabby weave, murmured softly to their threads as if whispering forgotten tales from a grandmother's loom. But even as the Middle Ages crept in, with castles sprouting like oddly shaped fungi and peasants inventing, swearing, the spirit of ancient weaving still lingered in the fabric. A Roman tunic lived on as a monastery robe. A Babylonian pattern found rebirth in a carpet, traded via a silk road that smelled perpetually of camel and coriander. In secret, woven symbols and tribal dyes carried stories, some true, some exaggerated beyond reason. But even exaggeration is a kind of heritage. As spinning wheels started purring and the first water-powered fulling mills gushed into motion, something began to unravel, metaphorically, though quite possibly literally too, if the stitching was poor. The whispers of hand spinners quieted down. Grandmothers told fewer yarn-based stories, mostly because everyone's fingers were now too busy learning how to work machines that went brrr instead of shoo. The Industrial Revolution loomed on the horizon, and frankly, it did not wear homespun. It wore calico, lots of it, more than anyone asked for. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Tonight is not a time for clanking factories or Dickensian child labourers tangled in conveyor belts. Tonight is the memory of a world beat softly into existence by heddles tapping against veils of sunlit linen. A world where textiles wrapped not only bodies, but births and deaths and everything between. Humans wove for celebration and for mourning, for dowries and for burial shrouds. They wove stories and seasons into their cloth. It wasn't just work, it was ritual with a good amount of lint. And so, this sleepy stretch of history draws its final thread, soft as alpaca, sturdy as hemp, and odd-smelling if left in a damp cellar. Now, you may still be wondering about loom weights carved with eyes, or about the travelling sheep shearer named Hector, who insisted his goats were more reliable than horses. But there will be time for those dreams another night. Perhaps you'll meet him in a half-woven dream, clopping past with a bale of scandalously dyed wool and a tuneless song on his lips. Close your eyes, gentle weaver of the modern age. The ancients have finished their spool. The last thread has been tied off, tucked in, smoothed beneath a patchwork quilt of centuries. Let the loom fall silent now, and may the distant hum of history, equal parts creaky and cozy, lull you into quiet, spinning sleep.